question, what does it mean for you to be a disciple? So that was, I thought, a very powerful lesson last week, although I didn't contribute much, got it started, but you guys had some great comments about that. I wanted to say how much, again, I appreciate it, and I'll probably mention it again this morning in our main service, how grateful I was for the ministry meeting last night, and you all need to appreciate what a miracle that is to have that size of a crowd, especially with some of the things right now. It gave me hope, because we really have been battling a spirit of lethargy in the church, not with everybody, but obviously a good portion. People are struggling with commitment and faithfulness, and it's always churches go through phases. They go through various seasons of different types of opposition. Sometimes we're dealing with an overt level of fornication and sexual immorality. Other times we're dealing with conflict among brethren. Other times we're dealing with what I described a little bit last night, and what I'm saying now is just a spirit of lethargy and this trend of long-term members of our congregation becoming Sunday morning only Christians. So these are shifts that we have to try to fight against, and you need to appreciate how hard it is and how much work is invested by myself, by Ernie works his tail off. He's going at it from early morning till late at night, and sometimes in the middle of the night, dealing with people, dealing with problems, trying to help and inspire people. Glenn, of course, Pastor Glenn has his own level of responsibilities, and underneath our labor and effort is you, his disciples, that by virtue of how you're deciding to live your life, you provide attention to maintain revival in our church. And so if we start losing it here, and we've even seen a drop-off in attendance in our serious men's class, it's picking up again. But and this has been the threat over the last several months to a year, maybe 2 years, is that, and I'm going to explain a little bit of it this morning, is that I've been losing disciples. Men who claim to want to preach, they claim to want leadership, they claim to want ministry, but they're not under my authority. They're out doing their own thing, and in many cases it's in defiance of what my advice is. So they're actually positioning themselves, and this loses the spirit throughout the church. And that may be, to some degree, what the source of some of the lethargy is. When you have men breaking out from underneath authority and the processes of discipleship, it creates a dimension and a dynamic that is very hard to counterbalance that. So that's my effort here. My goal is to have a steady, and I'm not totally, running a numbers game, but my goal is to have a steady 50 men in our serious men's class. That's what we're going to need in order to counterbalance some of these trends and these tendencies and the various seasons of opposition. If we have a steady 10% of our congregation, men, male, disciples, serious about their calling, their purpose, their mission, their ministry, whatever that may be, whether you're called to preach, be a missionary, or just a pillar in the church. If we have 50 men here that will position themselves as disciples, that's going to contribute so much to meeting the needs that we have in our church and fighting some of the trends and oppositions and tendencies that are constantly at work. So let's turn to our text. And I do want to get into the substance, and we're going to spend this week and probably next week and maybe the week after on this one message that I wrote on the subject of discipleship. There aren't two Bibles written, one for disciples and then another for everybody else. Every Christian should position themselves to be a disciple. We know that's unrealistic. Jesus had losses. Rich young ruler, Judas, he had a failure rate because not everybody that he dealt with, interacted with, challenged, not everybody that got healed. The Bible says in John 6:66 that from that day forward, many of his disciples ceased from following him. So that was probably numbers in the hundreds that forsook him that day. So in order to cultivate real disciples, you're going to have to deal with a lot of rejection. We do that as we make stands that we do. I had a lot of material that I was trying to get through last night, and I'm kind of apologize for being remiss in not perhaps communicating clearly some of the things that I discussed, like social media and other factors there. I just didn't have time to delve into each one, you know, for the 10 or 15 minutes that it may require. We would have been there all night last night, but I think I said enough to throw it out there. So if you have any questions about the ministry meeting, when I do open it up for questions this morning, you can ask that. When I was asked about social media by Nick last night, I mean, I'm a little slow and I'm a little thick, so you know, when I deal with movies and TV, cell phones, iPads, to me that's all social media, but I understood the specifics of his question that he was asking about things like Facebook and other forms that are a little bit different than just simply the generalization of the cell phone and you know, the ability to watch movies and so forth. They are kind of two separate things. So if you need any clarification about that, we can discuss that. So a few brief thoughts here today, and then we'll open it up for some questions. Let me read the text first, Matthew 28. Jesus came, verse 18, Jesus came and spoke to his disciples, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things. That's a hard task. Teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. So there's a dimension of authority that he's investing in his disciples to go out and make disciples. Discipleship is the dynamics of authority being exercised and authority being responded to, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So let me talk about this morning's subject is going to be the mandate of discipleship. So again, this is not just another style of ministry. I have to minister to all kinds of people. I have to preach to people that are half-hearted, lukewarm, compromising, struggling with sin, in and out of the church. But my primary mission in life, my primary calling is to make disciples. So my preaching and my efforts and my labors, although it does spread, and Pastor Ernie and Pastor Glenn are fully aware of that, but my primary calling is to make disciples. That's going to be the thrust of my preaching. My ministry is to challenge men and women to serve God at the highest level of commitment and the highest level of faithfulness. This is what Jesus mandated his disciples to do. You make disciples, you teach them to observe all things that I have commanded you to do. So he's investing authority for them to go forth and make disciples of all nations. So this is not just a suggestion. These are the very final words that Jesus spoke to his disciples. He's commanding this. There's a tone, and he's speaking this with a sense of urgency. Our calling is not to fill buildings with people. It's to make disciples. If buildings get filled, that's great. But I've always said I would rather see our men that I have out in the field pioneering a church with 10 people, 3 or 4 of those are disciples, than to see a church of 50 with no disciples. We have those out there. Church of 50 with no disciples. If you try to do a transition in a church with no disciples, very rough. Sometimes you lose half the crowd because you don't have men that are there that get it. When I left London, I had to leave London quite quickly, within a week, to get here to El Paso to take over this church in an emergency circumstance. I left my church in London, we were running about 60 to 70 at the time, not a huge crowd, but 20 or 25 of the people in the church were disciples, men disciples. Many of them are out pastoring today and missionaries today in various parts of the world and scattered all over England. So I was able to leave for 3 weeks. They had no pastor for that period of time. Marty Carnegie had to leave Jamaica. It took him a while to get himself organized, and travel arrangements and family moved. It was 3 weeks when the church didn't have a pastor, but the disciples ran everything. They kept it all moving, kept it all happening. There were no losses of crowd, and people were freaking out. They were able to stabilize everything. And of course, one of those men went on to pastor the church for 14 years after Marty had pastored it for 10 years. So that's what discipleship can produce. It produces stability. In this setting here, there's always chaos going on in the church. There's always problems and trouble and difficulty. We're always battling with sin and disobedience, and as I've described, lethargy and lukewarmness, and we're struggling against the weight and the pull of those things. It's disciples that bring stability to the ship and make everything work. So the word disciple is a very important word. The word Christian is not used in the New Testament but a couple of times. The word disciple is used dozens of times. And the word means someone who is a follower and a learner. So that speaks to a lot of dynamics that I'll get to throughout the course of this. It's more than someone who just attends church or superficially identifies with Christianity. We always have quite a number of people that will always and only come Sunday mornings. It doesn't mean I don't love them just as much. My job is to get them to heaven as well. It may be a little bit harder of a task. They may never fully grasp and get what we're about. They may never become a disciple in the sense that I'm ministering this morning. And sometimes, I think I mentioned it last night, and I've told the staff this, sometimes you just have to let people serve God, and on the terms that they're going to serve God, and try to work in the framework of that to help them along the way. Sometimes they'll break out from underneath their apathy, their lethargy, their lukewarmness, their half-hearted commitment, and get caught up and get on fire for God. Sometimes they won't. But we still have to love them and work with them. But what I'm looking for is followers and learners. That's what I'm striving towards. 16 times Jesus said in the Gospels that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John recorded the words or the term, follow me. So that meant something. That meant I want you here. That's authority. When he spoke to the rich young ruler and said, I want you to sell what you have, distribute it to the poor, take up your cross and follow me, he's making an effort to place authority over this man, hoping that he would respond to that authority and position himself next to Jesus and begin to follow him. But of course he refused that authority. And this is what we strive for. I look for men that are willing to come under authority, follow instruction, and those men have a future in discipleship. The hallmark of discipleship is commitment. I'm going to preach on that over the next few weeks in our main services at some point when we preach a sermon on the subject of commitment. It's a covenant relationship with your pastor, with his authority, where you're responsive to his instruction. And again, we've had cases where men claim to be disciples. They're not under authority, however. So don't call yourself a disciple if you're not following instructions and guidance and direction that your pastor is offering you. We believe in covenant relationship on a lot of levels. We believe in covenant relationship, obviously, in marriage. We believe in covenant relationship in the church, among brethren, and that makes us very unique in the world that we live in. The average time that a person spends in any church is 2 to 2.5 years. And that's in charismatic and evangelical type of churches. What happens? There's no covenant relationship to begin with. And what happens generally is somebody gets in a fight or a tiff or a rift or a conflict or a difficulty, someone in that church that they have to leave. That's their solution to take care of their relational problems. We're going to be learning about resolving conflict in our Sunday school starting this morning. Resolving conflict is the business of people that are in covenant relationship with each other. If you're in a marriage, you work at fixing the problem. You don't leave. And the same is true in the house of God. We view these as unbreakable bonds of relationship that remain in place. I made a statement a number of years ago. In fact, I can remember when it was. It was in March when I first made this statement. And I had somebody come after me and blow back hard. But I made the statement in a sermon that I preached in March of 2009. I was preaching a sermon on the power of covenant. And I made the statement that I would no longer think of leaving my church or breaking relationship with my pastor than I would divorcing my wife. I put those covenant relationships on the same level as my marriage. This is what Jesus died for. He died to give birth to a church. A church is covenant relationship. And so we strive to maintain that covenant relationship. I have a very difficult time with how I was raised in the church, covenant relationship, my pastor's commitment to my life and my wife and my family, and just how we were raised. There's a reason why we call ourselves a fellowship. That's not just a pithy word that Pastor Mitchell pulled out of the sky, but it's how he started characterizing it. We are a fellowship of people in covenant relationship with each other, and we view those as unbreakable bonds. And part of that dynamic of relationship between a pastor and disciples is the dynamics of the dimension of authority. Pastor Warner, Pastor Mitchell have authority over my life. And they have exercised it, and they need to exercise it, and I want them to exercise it, and I want to continue to be a learner. I want to position myself to be taught, instructed, shaped, and molded by those who have authority over my life. In 1 Corinthians 12:18, the Bible says, "But now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body, just as he pleased." So this takes it out of the arena of your preferences and puts it in the context of something that God does. God takes you, and God takes you, and God takes you, and he's worked in the circumstances of your life to put you in the position where you are now. And this is what holds our church together. We wouldn't have one couple that would be willing to go if the average time any of you spent in this church was 2 years. Nobody could go anywhere. It's the stability of long-term members giving and praying and being faithful. When we bring our couples back for conference, they see the several hundred of their brethren that are there year after year, and it makes it very easy for them to go. That's the foundation. It's your presence and your faithfulness and your covenant relationship and your bonds of relationship and your financial contribution that provides a foundation that makes people want to go, that gives them the confidence that I can go, and I know these people that I'm in covenant relationship together with are going to remain in place. But what we're seeing today is a disintegration of covenant relationship, or a willingness to break and violate covenant, and that's something that I can't comprehend. Like I said, I would no more think of telling Pastor Warner to take a hike, or telling you all or my fellowship of this church or Pastor Mitchell and breaking and going off on my own. I would no more think of doing that than I would divorcing my wife. If that upsets you, that's fine, but I believe that's the intensity of the covenant relationship that we're bound by, and I don't think we can reach the world unless we have that level of covenant relationship. And again, we're living in an era where there's a breakdown of that. Romans chapter 1, verse 31 describes this breakdown and said, it's kind of in the middle of a discourse. I'm just reading the one verse. "Without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable and unmerciful." That word covenant breakers is a word that means people that are treacherous to vows. In other words, they'll make vows and then they'll pull away. It's the scripture in 2 Timothy when the Apostle Paul said, "For Demas has forsaken me," broke covenant, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica. So I've used the illustration before that the imagery there is very intense. Demas has forsaken me. And the imagery that I read from a commentator was the image of two people climbing a sheer cliff, and they're tethered together by a rope, and they're supposed to help each other. If one falters, the other holds on. If the one above slips away, the other below holds on, and they're tethered together by this rope. And what he described, the meaning of this was, is that Paul and Demas were tethered together. One of them began to fall, and rather than hold on for the safety of this individual, he pulls out a knife and cuts the rope to save himself. And so that's the dimension today, covenant breakers. We have individuals, sometimes prominent members of our church, will break covenant from time to time. It doesn't happen terribly often, but from time to time they do. They're there at conference, cheering when we plant churches, making commitments to pledge, and they're part of the foundation of structure that allows people to go into all the world and preach, and then they decide they're going to break covenant and go elsewhere. What if everybody did that? What if others followed your example? So this has to be factored in to when I ask the question, what does discipleship mean to you? It means covenant bonds of unbreakable relationship that we're going to stand side by side for the duration. So two final quick thoughts before we open it up to questions. Number one, two factors here that I want to kind of lay on you. First of all, a disciple is a person in training. It's not a person who's trying to serve God or better themselves, but it's a person in training. And the difference between someone who's trying, you can do that born of self-will, you can do that on your own, you can do that independently. A person who's in training is a person who's submitted to a program. There's a big difference between trying and training. If you're going to compete, for example, in the Olympics, you train for that. You get a coach. You submit yourself to a particular diet and a particular health program, particular style of training, depending on the discipline that you're going to be competing in. And you hire a coach, and your coach exercises authority, and you're in training. If you're serious about seizing God's opportunities for your life, this is what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to enter into training. You're going to have to build your life around certain priorities that will allow you to do what willpower will not accomplish. You can try to do a lot of things in life, but you can't just simply try to do the will of God. You have to submit yourself to discipleship, yield yourself to a program of training, and allow for authority to be exercised over your life. A disciple is someone who believes that God has a plan for his life and is committed to do their part, whatever the cost, whatever the sacrifice, in order to bring that about. They believe, a disciple believes that God has a destiny and a purpose. And this is a very serious issue. You're not going to get to that position in life without subjecting yourself to a training program that is in the context and the framework of the church, having a pastor, having ministry that you're responsible for, held accountable for. All of those dynamics are part of what it means, to be a disciple. So a disciple is someone who's in training, and as I've been iterating and reiterating, a disciple has a teacher. If you're a learner, that means you have a teacher. And if you have a teacher, that means you listen. And if you listen, that means you're submitted to authority. Jesus said, you go make disciples. In other words, he's saying, you go teach. You find men that will recognize your authority, submit to your authority, recognize that you have something to offer, and will put themselves in a position to be a learner or a student. This is contrary to the rationale, well, Jesus is my pastor, I don't need anyone. Well, then why does the Bible say to Christians to submit to one another in the Lord? Why is there so much language in the New Testament about the role of the pastor in your life? about the exercise of his authority and the benefit that is to you. My pastor's always been a blessing to me. That's how I view him. When I pray for Pastor and Mona Warner, I thank God for the gift of their lives. And there's been harsh language, corrective language that's had to come from my pastor. When we were disciples in the Tucson church, we walked on eggshells because we were held accountable. When I got saved, Pastor Warner was 24 years old. I was 19 years old. And he had the energy of 100 men and very intense. He's still that way, but back then, I mean, that's the way it was. And we immediately gravitated over a very short amount of time to surrendering my heart into his hands, his oversight, his authority, and his care of my life. This is why we do what we do. No, I'm not here to hurt anybody, to restrict anybody's freedom and liberty. When I bring correction, when I bring instruction, when I try to pull you in and begin to minister, provide you with guidance, help, and direction, is with the agenda of trying to be an instrument in God's hands to shape your lives. And so those are some of the dynamics. Next week I'm going to talk about the transcendency of discipleship. And by that I mean that no matter where we go in the world, discipleship works. In the poorest of poor countries, with people of such vastly different backgrounds than you have, we have missionaries in place that making disciples, and you would be amazed at the disciples that have been produced out of some of these countries. When you greet them, they have the same spirit that you do. It's an incredible dimension that there's nothing in common, socially, racially, experientially, financially, culturally, radical difference. You'd never come together, but discipleship and the impartation of the life of Christ from one heart to another puts you on equal footing. And it's one of the great joys that I have and the great delights that I have to be able to travel into Mexico, into Africa, and anywhere that I go and see the dynamics of discipleship taking place. Let's bow our heads for a moment before we open it up. There's a lot at stake when it comes to discipleship. I can't do my job without disciples. This congregation will swerve towards sin and lukewarmness. If it's just me on the platform battling away, preaching sermons, it's not going to be enough. There has to be disciples in whom the Word of God gets traction, and you begin to project the spirit of your pastor and the spirit of Christ throughout the congregation. That's what counterbalances these trends that we go through when sin begins to run rampant, or lethargy, or apathy. Prayer meetings begin to diminish. Outreaches begin to struggle. It's disciples, consistent, faithful men under authority who are able to counterbalance that. And I've told the staff, and I've learned over the years, that when we go through these phases in the church, you cannot get discouraged. You have to preach your way through them. Live for God through these times. Be consistent, be faithful, and it'll pass. Oppositions pass. Spiritual assaults against the church comes and goes. The devil gives up on one area and begins to inject himself in another area. So this is really a pitched battle constantly to maintain a dimension of revival in the church. And a lot of that depends on you men being disciples, whatever your calling and whatever your position is. So I want you to just take a moment right now and you pray to that end. God, this is what I want to be. A Christian, yes. A servant of the Lord, absolutely. A child of God. There's a lot of ways to describe yourself, but you better be able to describe yourself as a disciple. Surrender to God, looking for God's best, willing to come under authority, covenant bonds of relationship, helping one another, serving one another, recognizing the tough battle that a pastor has to fight constantly, and wanting to come alongside and help and support and project a spirit of revival into the church. Let's just take a moment and pray and talk to God. Father, we thank you so much today for the opportunity you've given us to serve you. We recognize the great privilege that we have being born into this fellowship, this congregation, in this particular time, Lord God, in this particular season of history, when we're facing the soon coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. We are in the midst of the last days revival, where you have promised to pour out your Spirit, and whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. God, I pray that you would fill us afresh with the power of the Holy Ghost. Energize us, O God. Hallelujah, Lord, for the spiritual power and trust and dimension to be instruments of revival for our church. For the last days, I commit myself to discipleship. I'm willing to pay the price to be under authority, to surrender my will for the will of another. God, I thank you for what you're doing. I thank you for the privilege and for the opportunity, and we give you praise for it. In the name of Jesus, let's give God praise. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Serious Men, Sunday school. It's because you have an appetite for that, and I am appreciative of that. Most churches around today couldn't cultivate this kind of a response to the preaching of God's Word. So last week, or I think it was last week, I challenged you, each of you, to identify one man in the church. I don't think this is an impossibility, but you identify one man who's not coming to these classes and may not quite yet be a disciple, may not get it yet, and work with that individual and try to bring them under your wing, teach them how to be a disciple, bring them to Serious Men's class. And I want to really challenge you with that. I'm going to mention that every single week. And it's not rocket science. This is how churches grow, by people bringing people. And in the context of our little community here in the church, there's that principle as well, disciples bringing other men that can become disciples. So let me open it up. If you have a question from last night about ministry, you can ask that, or anything to contribute about the subject of discipleship that we're talking about here. Anybody at all want to start us off this morning? Angel?
Pastor, the fight or flight response is a reaction to when we go through things, our instinct is to, you're either going to do one or the other. So as it relates to what you mentioned, the comment back in March of 2009, I tell men, Ephesians 5:25, it says, husband, love your wives as Christ loved the church and he gave himself for her. So when you think about these two things, why does the Bible put these two into context? Yeah. If you have a falling out with your wife, you're not gonna, just in the middle of the night, I'm gone. Yeah. Furthermore, the brethren, you try to, and it's critical because as we're building churches, it's inevitable. And we're gonna go into, and as disciples, as pastors, I think we need to learn to be able to weave through situations.
Amen. Very good. Covenant relationship. Anybody else? Question, comment, testimony? Amen. Anything else?
Just real quick, I always think, under this guy Baruch, who served under Jeremiah for something like 45 years or something. Because if you look in the Word of God, this principle is it's all over the Word of God. It's not just even New Testament. And during that time, the Babylonians were coming in, and everybody's selling off their land cheap, and I mean, nobody's buying anything. And God speaks to Jeremiah and tells him, buy this land. He bought a big piece of land cheap, and it was almost like a mockery. People were like, you're buying it, you're stupid. And you know, God told him, buy it. And he put the deed in a thing, and he buried it. And God told him, give it to Baruch. He says, and he told him, and he gave him a word, like a word of knowledge. Told him there's going to be, you know, land that's going to be, you know, because people are going to come back. You know, people are going to come back. You know, everything's going to be rebuilt. And he gave, and you know, Jeremiah was told by God to give it to Baruch, his disciple.
Yeah.
And you know, that's I read that many years ago, and it's like if we're going to have an inheritance, it's going to be linked to our relationship. You know,
that's right. Inheritance is always linked relationally. You can't do this on your own. In relationship, in some context, has a dimension of authority, as I said. That's one of the great keys of discipleship. Amen. Very good. Anybody else? Anything to add to what we've said thus far? Yes, Paul.
Pastor, I think of the Bible as a book of covenant. You know, how Abraham had a covenant with God. And that's really, you know, part of the basis of our salvation, our life in Christ. I mean, first of all, us with God, but then with our pastor, with the brethren, that type of thing.
The same principle filters all the way through. The Bible says that God is faithful for 1,000 generations. He makes promises, and those promises endure throughout the ages. He works to fulfill. There's a lot of twists and turns because of human nature, human behavior, because of sin and rebellion. But God never abandons his agenda. He works around and through and above and beneath and gets his agenda accomplished because he's a covenant-keeping God. And you and I are sitting here because of that. The human race would have been lost a long time ago if God was not covenant-keeping, and that spirit is what holds the church together. Andre.
When you're a disciple, what did Pastor Warner do to draw, like, how did he draw you into the discipleship?
He was on fire. He didn't have to. He just was on fire and we wanted to be around him. That's it. I preached that sermon at conference on the double portion on Elijah and Elisha. You know, Elisha said, I want a double portion of your spirit. Right? So the attraction was Elijah's own relationship with God. He's on fire, and this drew men to himself. And that's the great key one of the great keys to discipleship is, where are the men around you? This is what I ask pastors. Where are the men around you that want a double portion of what you have? You got to be able to attract men. You got to be able to sit across from them and set them on fire. And it's not because you're trying to necessarily. It just happens by virtue of what God's doing in your life. There's a zeal, there's an enthusiasm, there's a passion that's contagious. I would say that's what it was. It's not some strategy. You know, we don't walk around with a match trying to get men set on fire, but we just are on fire ourselves. Charles Finney, the great evangelist from the 1800s, people would ask what was the key to his success, and he said, well, I stand I stand behind the pulpit, God sets me on fire, and people come and watch. They watch me burn. So that's what you have to have. If you're going to have disciples, you've got to get yourself on fire. You'll draw men. Men are looking to be inspired. And I'm always, you know, dubious, and I always question when I go preach for someone, I don't see any disciples. Something's not right. Something's wrong. And you better figure it out or come home for redirection and figure it out there. You better work this out. Amen. Is that, I kind of meandered there.
No, so what you said when you're pioneering, the key is just to get men on fire.
Well, you're going to draw visitors. You do events that draw visitors. You witness in the streets. And out of the people that come, you start working with them. And in the beginning, that's what it is. It's a lot of follow-up. In the beginning of pioneering a church, people are going to come because of you. They have to like you. They have to be inspired by you. A lot of times people can come to this church for 6 months before I ever personally meet them because churches grow, the foundation of discipleship extends, and a lot of people are going to come because of you. You invited somebody, you met them at work or school. But in the beginning, they're going to come, they have to like you, they have to be inspired by you. And so whatever man would come, I would always make it a point to try to get with them outside the church, get coffee, and try to communicate my spirit. And, you know, I remember when Joe Agunya, Peter Ajala, Jay Numbard, Simeon Oshumbemi, when they started coming to the South London Church early on, I was able to make a connection. They were all much younger than myself. I was able to make a connection with them, got them stirred up for the things of God, and they took off. So that's what you're looking for when you're pioneering. You're looking for men. It's not a crowd that's going to change the world. We appreciate numbers, but you have to have disciples. Amen. Anybody else? Very good. Very good. Anybody else? Yes, Rick.
Yeah, the definition of discipleship, as you mentioned, was a learner and follower. And it just came to mind that Jesus always challenged the disciples to follow him, right? Those people. So he didn't ask them to accept him, believe him, or even worship him, but the challenge was to follow me. So
Yeah.
one of the questions I asked myself, am I following or am I not?
Yeah.
You know, that's a crucial
Well,
question.
I think what that is Jesus wants them in proximity. And if they're in proximity to watch what he does, what he's healing and ministering, and then he's able to minister to them, they're going to grow, develop, and learn. You know, a lot of his ministry to his disciples, he'll correct them, but he doesn't ask them to repent. They will repent. They're going to get it. They're going to see it. And I'm using one of those scriptures this morning when the disciples, you know, wanted to sit one on his right hand and one on his left. He didn't rebuke them for that. He gently corrected them, set it straight. It's not going to be like that among you. And then went on, just by virtue of hanging around, you become like it. And by hanging around, you'll recognize the wrongdoing and you'll strive to be right. You don't always have to jam people, correct every wrong that you see. As a disciple maker, you've got to be patient with people. You know, you have to choose the battles that you want to fight, and you really want to hammer and challenge and rebuke and correct. You don't do that every day. That's not what discipleship is. Discipleship is just projecting your spirit, and what we have is communicable. It's not so much taught as it is caught. There's teaching obviously involved, but people have to catch what we are and get it. And they do that by proximity, by following.
That's the other side of the story. Well, in Spain, so long story short, like you invest, as a pastor's kid, you don't have lots of friends, you know. So there's disciples, you know, they're growing up, and then, you know, outreach, everything together. Then he goes and, you know, he fornicates and he starts bad mouthing the church, my dad. Then a couple years later, you know, another guy I grew up with, close, outreaching, vision, everything together. Same thing, you know, and then he just left, you know. So I remember that night that I promised myself I'm never gonna invest in anybody else, you know, I'm never gonna have a best friend, you know. And I mean, it hurts a lot. That's why it hurts so much when people break covenant. So my question is, how do you deal with, you know, with not getting, you know, what's the word, you know, scarred or hurt or just mistrusting people, and yet still investing in people again, you know, even though knowing that, you know, it might.
Well, it just has to be in you. I mean, Ernie struggles with this constantly. Sometimes the people that he pours himself into the most up and leave. So you have to, as they say, have a thick skin and a tender heart. For every couple who's in a crisis that we're able to guide to redemption, we may lose 20. Right? We swing for the fences, and when you swing for the fences, you strike out a lot. Babe Ruth had the home run record, but he also had the strikeout record. Wow. It's just part of life. Jesus had to endure betrayal, didn't he, in order to reach. So over time, and the closer you get to God, I think the more you're able to handle the betrayals and the rejections and the assaults that come. You know, I can think of one disciple in particular. I mean, gave a lot to this young man and his wife. I mean, they turned on me, hurt me badly. You have to survive it and still love people and still invest in people. Someone asked Pastor Mitchell, after our split in the fellowship in 1990, and then a minor split a little while after that, a smaller one, someone asked him, what would you do if everybody left? He said, well, I would find one person that I could invest in again. Wow. So I think the better our relationship is with Christ, the more we can handle what you're talking about. So the antidote for the hurt and the woundings and the rejections and the wanting to say never again will I put myself on the line like that for someone, is you need to get close to God. Yeah.
Just really quick to kind of make a comment about what you had said, Josh. I've been on that end where I've broken a covenant with someone. And you know how he was mentioning, like, what do you do in those situations? Sometimes when you keep that compassion, because I've broken covenant with people, and they've still said, you know what, I'm going to be here for you. And that is what, like, honestly just breaks you down as a person. Because there's been times where, even with my own father, like, he's just invested. And I've just betrayed him and just like, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to do anything with this, with God, none of that. And the truth is that when you're down that point and that person's still there to like show you compassion and love, that's what really brings you back.
I think God gives us certain circumstances so that we have the thick skin and that thing.
It's just life. Life will do that to you. I don't know how much God purposefully does that. It's just the nature of our ministry, the nature of the business that we're engaged in, the fickleness of people. It's just life. And over time, you develop the thick skin and maintain it. You have to be able to handle the brutality of assaults and rebellion and betrayals, and at the same time keep giving and loving people. That happens over time. Yeah, George.
You know, Pastor, one of the main things, I'm hearing what people are saying, and one of the things in my heart, I go, why do I do what I do? And the truth is, after reading the Bible several times and, and watching life, and, life makes no sense without Jesus Christ. It's just that simple, and my tendency is, I know who I am, and I could get very distracted. And to me, that brings fear, because I could get away from having my eyes on Him. And so that's why I do what I do, because to me, it just doesn't make any sense. Without Jesus Christ, it's just air, there's nothing.
That's right.
All that, the good thing in me is really, it comes from Him. My talent, my ability, my, everything. I can't really do anything without Him. It is true. And so stepping away from Him to me, it's like, the whole, there's nothing there.
Amen. Very good. Let's finish with that. Let's all stand. Thank you again for being here, prayer meeting at